Okay, we're back. This is the first anniversary of the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. And this is episode 53, beginning of the second year. This is a series of ruminations that we do once a week, myself and Julie Rauer. And we just had a weird glitch come up on our screen. We weren't sure what it meant, but we've had situations where we've done programs and done broadcasts and then they didn't record. So I didn't want to have this kind of get defaulted. Anyway, hopefully everything is fine and we've decided to restart. So, with that said, let us begin again. So, quantitative imaginations are an idea that I've kind of probably more related to the nature of the creation of a particular piece of work. And again, it kind of follows through from my readings recently in this beautiful book that Julie got me, which is Alfred North Whitehead's Science in the Modern World, in which case, what we're talking about is the idea that uh, the 17th century, the century of genius, gave us a certain understanding of the way in which we could make formulations in terms of what I would call unbreakable bonds. We've talked about unbreakable bonds as things that exist socially in terms of mapping the progress of civilizations. And I've used the idea of the fact that at the time when technique is associated with superstition or religion, we were incapable of advancing technique because we didn't have a way of checking our result. When we decided to kind of couple technique with reason and with science, we were able to understand that we could actually check that result. As a result, we understood how to go from a kind of like a superstition or religious or even a metaphysical capability of kind of dealing with reason or technique and basically making it scientific. And the two pieces that Whitehead speaks about in terms of that capability was, in fact, experimentation and the inductive method. And one of the things that I think sometimes people get confused is the difference between induction and deduction. But more importantly, what Whitehead talks about was the complexity and intricacy of induction in terms of its quality to be a generative strategy. Because what I think he understood in the case of, actually, this is good that we got screwed up because I'm saying this much more articulately now. What he understood in the consequence of Leonardo, rather than the kind of formulation of Bacon, which he talked about, was the idea of the imagination as the generative capacity that simply making a formulation was not a given and it wasn't kind of something that was to be taken for granted, because in fact the potential of the speculation was in fact an adventure that had certain specific parameters that actually had a certain style and character. So each one gave you a certain role and a certain possibility rather than just simply saying we definitively had made this case. And I think that was one of the things that I think people kind of miss out. I think the thing that people talk about is, once I have a formulation, I now do experimentation to kind of check and find results to prove that that formulation is correct. However, this idea has a flaw. It's like, oh, yeah, these facts definitely follow from this formulation. However, it's only as good as the formulation. So the reality is, as further formulations will come, that can unsettle and kind of destabilize the significance of these things, or basically just kind of parentheses or contextualize these things. And the importance is, we never have an actual true fact. We only have a kind of like the potential for a deeper understanding of a circumstance. So I'm not saying there's no value in facts, because that's not the case. There's a tremendous value in facts and data. The thing is, understand what the data basically is telling you. And that's always the hard part. That's the part that makes for genius. Genius is that ability to do that. And I think what Whitehead talks about, and that was what I was kind of taking about before. So back to this piece that I read. Okay. Okay, let me see if I can find it. Here we are. So read a little bit further here. Perhaps the man who most completely anticipated both Bacon and whole modern point of view was the artist Leonardo da Vinci, my hero, who lived almost exactly a century before Bacon. Leonardo also illustrated the theory, which I was advancing in my last lecture, that the rise of naturalistic art was an important ingredient in the formulation of our scientific mentality. Indeed, Leonardo was more completely a man of science than was Bacon. The practice of naturalistic art is more akin to the practice of physics, chemistry, and biology than is the practice of law. We all remember the saying by Bacon's contemporary Harvey, the discoverer of the circulation of the blood, that Bacon wrote of science like a Lord Chancellor. But at the beginning of the modern period, Da Vinci and Bacon stand together as illustrating the various strains which have combined to form the modern world, namely legal mentality and the patient observational habits of the naturalistic artists. Now, another thing he talks about is the special difficulties raised by induction emerged in the 18th century as the result of Hume's criticism. But Bacon was one of the prophets of the historical revolt, which again, we talked about the historical revolt as that point where they basically formulated that these rational intentions were better served by coupling with experimentation and the inductive method than by metaphysical speculation. And in this case, that turned out to be true because we actually had the ability to go from speculating as to the the possibility of technique to actually kind of being able to inductively kind of figure out what we could do in terms of discerning in a much more specific way. And I think as time's gone on, we've kind of seen the kind of metaphysical tradition become more scientific, maybe to the benefit or maybe to the detriment of metaphysics. But at the same time, it definitely went from the kind of point of view of kind of natural philosophical approach to a kind of like split between a scientific and a philosophical approach. Maybe Whitehead's brilliance is, aside from the kind of way of kind of like uh, emancipating a static metaphysics, is the idea of kind of tying that back together and being able to understand that as the complexity of these two sides of the coin became, they were capable of basically being brought back together. I've read some things that make me think that that's something that Whitehead is speculating about. I don't know if I have the capacity to explain the whole thing, but I do feel that that's kind of somewhat of the consequence. So anyway, the special difficulties raised by induction emerged in the 18th century as a result of Hume's criticism, but Bacon was one of the prophets of the historical revolt, which deserved the method of unrelieved rationalism and rushed into the other extreme of basing all fruitful knowledge upon inference from particular occasions in the past to particular occasions in the future. I do not wish to throw any doubt upon the validity of induction when it has been properly guarded. My point is that the very baffling task of applying reason to elicit the general characteristics of the immediate occasion as set before us in direct cognition is a necessary preliminary. If we are to justify induction, unless indeed we are content to base it upon our vague instinct, that is, of course, it is all right. Either there is something about the immediate occasion which affords knowledge of the past and the future, or we are reduced to utter skepticism as to memory and induction. This is the key part. It is impossible to overemphasize the point that the key to the process of induction, as used either in science or in our ordinary life, is to be formed in the right understanding of the immediate occasion of knowledge in its full concreteness. It is in respect to our grasp of the character of these occasions in their concreteness that the modern developments of psychology and of psychology in physiology and of psychology are of critical importance. So, with that said, again, a very long introduction. We'll go to the part that everyone loves, especially after these long, laborious, kind of like tedious, kind of technical things. What's new in Julie? So,
thank you. Now that we hopefully have our technical.
Oh, if this happens again,
we will scream.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we are very smart, but we're not tech geeks. So this just isn't our area. Thank you. I'll take this opportunity to recommend where we left off. Organic teas tea, specifically rose, and as an independent researcher in plant science as well as mycology, rose petals and those beverages and foods made with made with a substantial amount of rose petals.
I was dying.
Oh,
I could have drowned.
Sorry. Mm-hmm.
No, I gave it to you a second because I wanted to sip so badly, but then it's like I'm
sorry.
I'm
Okay.
to steal some.
So it turns out they're very antibacterial and antiviral, and in fact, they have a very high efficacy rate against a lot of foodborne pathogens, Staphylococcus, E. coli. I mean, it's actually pretty powerful stuff. And it keeps you awake when you haven't gotten a lot of sleep and it's late. Okay, so what is new? Well, I just launched a new science drawing that I just started yesterday at the Met. Hadn't gotten very far. I did have a lot of interest from people at the Met who are asking me what I was doing. And I, stop if someone has a genuine interest to explain to them. Bruce, if you'd be kind enough to hold this up so I may talk about it. Okay. Hopefully there's a lot of pencil on there, so hopefully it's not sending off too much glare. This is a study of the formulation or the conversion of highly toxic substances that are present in all deep sea heat vents, where, as you may or may not know, all sorts of wildlife flourishes in extremely hostile territory. Usually these creatures are formerly known as extremophiles. Extremophiles are animals and plants and fungi which exist and thrive actually in very extreme, usually are considered inhospitable environments to humans who could not survive there for even a moment. The extremely hot, boiling temperatures, but a lot of very toxic substances come out of these thermal heat vents from the ocean floor, notably arsenic and trisulfate, a form of sulfur. And in this form, it's incredibly toxic, but this beautiful, gorgeous worm, which is this incredible, robust, rich, very, very ochreous yellow with wonderful feathery antennae. It drifts in these Star Trek suction cups, and it's a graceful. It looks almost like a nudibranch, which it is not. They can't survive down there. They, exist in higher parts of the ocean that are not quite as extreme as far as I know. It does move like a nudibranch called a Spanish dancer, but it is not a Spanish dancer. Anyway, this worm converts these highly toxic substances into a relatively neutral yellow pigment. Mm-hmm. And so the pigment was basically actually used to illuminate medieval manuscripts, the very bright, almost preternaturally bright yellow color. It's incredibly vivid. It's a pigment that goes way beyond any lemon that you have ever seen. So what I'm doing is I am fusing it with a Cambodian, a beautiful, beautiful artifact in the Southeast Asian wing at the Met, and you can see it coming in here. I just started to hybridize this today, hadn't gotten as far as I would have liked. A very elaborate palanquin shield. So a palanquin was basically used to transport people, usually people of stature or wealth or importance. And it was carried usually by other people, unfortunately. So it is the perfect metaphor, actually, as one organism that carries other substances, actually. And in the middle of the palanquin is a demon horse fighting with a man, I believe a folk hero, not particularly named. So this is what the drawing is going to be. And I just found, and I didn't think I could find it. I get very excited by new ideas in science, especially finding a piece of research that I thought might not exist. I looked for and found the exact moment whereby this sea worm does convert the trisulfur and arsenic into this, much less lethal substance by which it colors itself. So it kind of stands as a pennant to its chromatic success, you could say. But I found a research article showing the process. So in this space here, I am going to actually draw in the scientific process. And that will link the two portions of my drawing.
Interesting. Good. Well, you're off to a good start. Actually, yeah, by all means. I think one of the things I noticed is the fact that, like, the integration of the pieces is more is kind of more articulated, more articulate in this case than I find in some of the others. But again, one of the things that I think is important here is that it's not a diagram, it's not an illustration. It's a series of kind of composite circumstances that basically create an impression. And I think that if one looks for certain things, like one would look for a kind of process in a diagram, that's not the point. I think the point is to understand that there's enough of the impressions of the aspects that are used in the formulation to create the resonance of the idea, or the resonance of the metaphorical operation of these things towards a completion.
Yeah. So you're right. This entire drawing is the metaphor of the conversion process that produces orpiment. And just a quick weird aside, it was claimed that when he was incarcerated in the asylum, that Van Gogh chose to eat orpiment, which I find really, it made me a little hard to believe. They claim that he ate orpiment, or the pigment of yellow, which is still very toxic to humans. Quite actually. It's only the deep sea worm that can actually tolerate what it converts. It's still highly, highly toxic. To feel happy, which seems like an absurd thing. I mean, it sounds like something that a history scholar would write, or like a fine art major. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
No. In fact, one of the things that's interesting is that, I always loved, Freud's analysis of Leonardo, is as flawed as it was. It was an attempt to understand the nature of how an individual like Leonardo went about his life. And I think one of the things about Van Gogh was, I think that the only person who could basically really understand or appreciate Van Gogh was someone who was like Van Gogh, which of course is
Absolutely.
incredibly difficult to say. So, an individual who kind of sits in libraries and kind of like has a fairly kind of like boring and insipid existence in what Whitehead would call an inertial kind of boorish mentality would be incapable of kind of intuitive nature to understand why Van Gogh might have smelled or tasted or
They wouldn't understand
sensed
any of
his
his
intuition. Yeah, I
motivations
mean,
for
the
anything.
the the thing that was great about the analysis of by Freud was that you get a felt the sense that he understood the mechanism of Leonardo. I don't believe that few, if any, are capable of understanding the mechanism of Van Gogh. And I think what Whitehead talked about was the fact that in the case of Leonardo, Leonardo felt the possibility of the century of genius, whereas Bacon kind of understood it intellectually. And it was a very different way in which he understood that mentality. If I was going to say that someone was capable of understanding Leonardo, it would be someone like Whitehead
Hmm.
or someone like Freud.
Yeah.
But I don't think it would be some. I think there are certain people who kind of had the ability and they have to be of a certain consequence to understand the nature of a life like that.
Right.
And you
So,
can't do
yeah.
that by just simply being an academic.
I know it certainly wouldn't be by being an armchair academic who can't draw, can't paint, and
Mm-hmm.
has absolutely no
Mm-hmm.
idea what the psychology
Yeah.
is of people who actually do draw and paint and what was going
Mm-hmm.
through his head. And
Yeah. I think artists are sensitive. Certain people are sensitive to know, they sense a need for something. They sense a desire to reach out and kind of put something in their mouth or in their body in some ways. And I think I could understand the fact that Van Gogh understood the idea of kind of possibly coming to appreciate the value and the necessity. I mean, I think that if someone said Van Gogh felt color, I'd believe that, but it would have to be believed by someone who actually could understand what that means. And that's something that someone could say just to kind of for attention, but it's something that someone could say that they actually understood what that means.
well, here's a thought,
Mm-hmm.
and then we should go back to our topic.
Mm-hmm.
Is when Van Gogh was incarcerated, at first he was denied access to his paint. He was
Mm-hmm.
denied the ability to actually draw and paint.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe finally, when I guess he was able to access some of his art supplies in whatever state they were,
Mm-hmm.
are you okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, he probably felt that they, and I don't think he was anthropomorphizing them, they were as much his substance as he was of their substance,
Mm-hmm.
that he was simply taking in his own substance that he had been denied. And I think it was nothing
That
more than
makes sense
that.
because I mean he would
Yeah.
possibly, like a termite,
Yeah.
process his work through his body, and I think in that
This was
case that
his
makes
wood.
perfect sense. Yeah, sure. So in his case, it's like he actually I digested it because he
His
understood it.
cellulose, if
Yeah,
you will. Yeah.
exactly. But I mean, he understood the pigment as a real function of his body, not just something he puts on a brush.
It was an extension of his mind. So
Exactly.
anyway, we should
But again,
probably go
yeah.
to our
So
topic.
anyway,
Yeah.
so
So
what are we
I
talking about? We're talking about the
let me
idea
put my
of a
drawing
kind of
right above my
quantitative
mouth.
imagination. And the question is, whose responsibility is it to analyze the apparatus of formulation? It's the artist. I think one of the things that we're kind of struggling with right now is the fact that there are institutions who exist now and are very powerful, who've taken over the idea of what the formulations are to be. And I find this to be incredibly troubling because these people are not artists, or as they are, they're usually poor artists. They're people who kind of put in these positions because they don't pursue art in a meaningful way anymore, or they don't pursue music in a meaningful way, or they were once this and then they're that. And, I think that this sets the wrong example. Um, the artist is not just known for his technique or for accomplishment, he's known for his vision. And I think what happens is that kind of sense that Whitehead was talking about Leonardo was that there's a certain potential in that case. Now, again, that's different than now, but there was a certain ability to understand the nature of induction by being a naturalistic artist. And I think that analogy has potential. So I feel that right now, the idea is understand the quantitative imaginations. And what is that? Quantity usually is taken as number, like 5 wheelbarrows or 10, snow shovels or whatever. But in fact, what I'm talking about is the idea of accumulation, of the idea of kind of formulation through accumulation, that things are manifest together as a total operation, as a method, as a process. So I think in that case, similar to the idea of the unbreakable bond or the metaphor, right? The quantitative imagination or quantitative imaginationing is the way in which one goes about creating any object or any artifact or anything, in the fact that, like, it has, in this case, the idea of certain imaginations being built upon with other imaginations. The point I was trying to make, and maybe it's a good analogy, maybe it's not, you tell me, is the fact that the way in which one formulates within uh, the induction is to be able to kind of find that specific character of the formulation as a result of having a well observed knowledge of those things that allows for that formulaic kind of like leap of faith. I think that things are accrued on top of other things to create a final correlation that has a resonance that's independent of the pieces. And I think from there, one kind of comes to understand what that formulation is. But that I want to clear up in terms of just exactly the difference between quantity in a general sense and quantity in a specific sense of this. So anyway, as a result, I think that's kind of the basic premise. So now what's the value of this? The value of this is the fact that it is a way in which a method can exist in order to kind of formulate. And like I said, I mean, I think that there's a tremendous amount of creative frustration right now, and I see it talking to friends, in the fact that we are we're not adventurous in our formulations. We're basically incredibly conservative, and I think what happens is they seem to even be, in some cases, nonsensical. So I look at the fact that, again, like I said this kind of previously, is that based on certain times, certain individuals understood that even with the basic understanding they had of themselves, of their trade, of their craft, they were able to basically take that and say, okay, I have enough knowledge and I have enough technique that I can go out there and make my own inventions. And I think that since what we're going to be talking about and talking about more over time is this idea of as original ideas, the beauty and necessity of original ideas. And I think this is the kind of thing that's holding us back. I think it's like, it reminds me of, I think it's the beginning of Nature by Emerson, where he talks about the fact, no, I think it's in Self-Reliance, where he talks about the thing that once you understand, the most frustrating thing, paraphrasing here, is to actually have read back to you your own thoughts because you were not courageous enough to basically speak of them with consequence. And I think that's the kind of thing here, is that I think we're in a position where we need to start having faith in ourselves to kind of do that. I mean, as it's interesting because, like, it's been a while since I've kind of formulated organic design thinking, but the reality is, for me, this always made sense. But it kind of came to kind of like accrue to me the idea that in order to get to the point where I could kind of have faith in the process, I had to have trained myself in understanding the things that allowed me to make this. Now, the two things that make that are drawing and building models. And it's interesting. Someone says, like, architects make buildings. Like, they don't make buildings. Contractors make buildings. Architects make models. And that was something I don't know who said that, but I've heard that. And I think it's a brilliant point, because the thing is, scientists make models, architects make models, engineers make models. Models are speculations, right? They're basically formulations of what could conceivably be. So analogies are incredibly potent in terms of this process. And that's why at a certain point, you start to kind of need to understand that the the processes themselves, the procedures themselves, are not to be enslaved to some other program. They are themselves the generator. So the point is, in my case, the ability to play the music gives you the possibility to understand what the music can do. And the same thing in this case is that understanding how your body moves gives you understanding of how bodies could conceivably move and be conjoined in a series of movements. So in the case of architecture, my feeling is you as an individual need to see drawing and model building as the process from which things come, rather than simply see them as just servants of some other thing that has no interest to you. They are in themselves the generator. So you see, you're chomping at the little bit here.
Yes, you're very, very observant. Yes, I truly am. This
Go.
is a segue.
Go, pussycat, go.
Thank you. A sparkling, magical segue to the most amazing research article I've read in quite a while in Science, among many, which actually speaks in a volume about quantitative imagination, which is interestingly never ascribed to arthropods, to invertebrates. In fact, uh, most human personality traits are presumed to exist only in the human mind. And the human mind is seen as a cathedral, and the animal mind is seen as far inferior. And I don't believe that for a moment. I think the people who do are sincerely deluded. Anyway, I would like to bring
That's a good
up...
analogy, though. I want to build on that after you're done. After you're done.
Sure thing. Then I'll create the foundation for you. I'm all stuffed up again. Hay fever. So, architectural immunity in Lasius niger ants, who alter their nest networks to prevent epidemics. This is huge. I mean, this is architecture. It's creative architecture. It is engineering with vast, progressive, learned imagination. This is quantitative imagination at its best.
It is.
This is not following a prescribed book of rules. This is not L. Niger Ants looking at an issue of an architecture journal and saying, oh, we'll do that. This is something that is progressive, that is constantly changing, and in this case, with dire circumstances.
But it must be inherent in the initial structure in order to be adaptable.
I'm going to say that. Right?
Okay, because I see the fact that that's something that, like, that's for unforeseeable in current architectural circumstance. This is something where it's not, where it's actually something plastic that they can manipulate.
Yes, this is highly plastic, and that's what I'm going to say. Exactly what they do that is ingenious and creative and plastic and imaginative. And if anyone needs a case for the neuronal plasticity of invertebrates, of arthropods, one has to only look at this example. So they do the following things, which could be considered social nest manipulation. Okay, they introduced pathogen treated individuals, meaning they cure some individuals into nest digging groups, which is a brilliant thing. They also monitor three-dimensional nest morphogenesis, also a brilliant thing. Now, here are the architectural alterations, which I have termed divergent engineering. So, what the divergent engineering is a brisk clip, faster nest growth. Now, this is fascinating. Increased inter-entrance distances. They don't talk about exits, but obviously I will postulate entrances and exits are going to be spaced wider. What they're doing is they are isolating the diseased individuals but not entombing them, not imprisoning them. This is actually a socially, architecturally very, very progressive thing. They're not punishing the victim ants. They are allowing them to come and go, but not infect the nest. It's actually, and I will use the right word, very compassionate.
It's interesting. When
Yeah.
we had a similar thing, and this was like one of our great social disasters of all time.
You
Was
mean
how
the
we
COVID?
absolutely. But I remember like there was this there was
Oh,
this
crazy word.
there was this short video, a series that they had done with some series of kind of algorithmic kind of consequences in terms of the spread of the virus. I remember they had, I think it was Johns Hopkins or Duke had made that little, and it was just
I believe it was Johns
incredibly
Hopkins.
simplistic and like insipid.
It was.
And it was just
it didn't actually include anything relevant or anything important.
No, it didn't. And I think, here's a good example of the fact that we were not only, clueless, we were completely unprepared for something we should have been. And in fact, part of the irony was the fact that we were doing this allegedly because we wanted to be able to kind of anticipate how we would handle it.
True.
And we did anticipate it. We'd handle it fucking terribly. And it was like, but I mean, here we have a situation where they've not only understood this, but they understand this as a consequence of how to basically adapt circumstances. So there's actually if you see their city as an organism, right? Their city is an organism that has a functional morphology.
In fact, yes, they are. In fact, the L Niger ants are in fact and can be seen as the microorganisms inhabiting the macroorganism of their living polis.
And to go backwards, this at one point was, as our topic was last week, a novel utility.
Yes, it is.
That basically was used.
This is a bridge topic.
It is a bridge topic. So that novel utility was part of the accretion of their quantitative imagination.
Yes. And here is the kicker on all of this. If you want to see insect imagination at work, check out this. Reduced chamber centrality. They alter their central chambers, which are key physical, architectural, and engineering structures at will, not at random, in smart, rational ways, always adapting, changing incrementally. So this is incremental, quantitative imagination. This is not randomized, we will dig a chamber here. They are in fact altering their nest topology to be inhibitory to a bacterial invasion, a viral invasion. And this, to me, and this is my particular take, this demonstrates quantitative imagination, which are attributes that are almost never associated with invertebrates or arthropods, and is in fact a synergy of architectural and behavioral responses. Take it from here.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I mean, honestly, it reminds me of the time that we spoke.
How fascinating is that?
No, it's brilliant. Yeah. And I think this is the thing, is when you were talking about the fact that humans see their mind as a cathedral, and they see insect minds as
a wheelbarrow.
And the thing is, honestly, that is just so incredibly. It's like there's a certain.
We have pictures to back.
That's funny. There's a certain just ignorance that makes somebody say something that stupid,
and it is,
and it really is. And I think it's one of the things I remember is in the process of my intellectual development, there was still this idea, which I think kind of was from these previous centuries, where we saw the pinnacle of the natural world in humans. And now we're starting to realize that we do okay, but we're not as brilliant as we kind of see ourselves as. And we've started to reevaluate that incredibly arrogant and insipid formulation. So we now kind of start to understand that we not only are not the pinnacle, that we may not even have begun to start to see how much we're not. but at least it's a start. But one of
Only
those
if you look
things,
for it.
yeah, but
Yeah.
you first have to
Yeah.
acknowledge it,
Yeah.
and you need a certain amount of self-reflection to be able to come to that. So I think
Yeah.
that makes me, things like Nathan just encourage me to kind of realize, like, I want to have an ant's brain or a termite's brain or a wasp's
Doesn't it
brain.
just make you just marvel?
Yeah, it does, and it just makes me feel like, wow, I'm in the way. I should let them take over, and we're kind of really in the way.
No,
Let
so
these superior species
Mhm.
take over, and we just kind of bow out.
Do you have another tie? I have a
No, I
second
do, I
topic.
do, I
Oh,
do,
yeah,
because like I
say.
think
Then
what
I'll say
happened
my
was,
second
one of the
topic.
things I was trying to say was,
Yeah.
in the case of this quantitative imagination, this is how one goes about creating the formulations and understanding the kind of primacy of these formulations, because this is the kind of thing that allows us the emancipation so that we can put ourselves where we belong. And I think artists need to emancipate ourselves from these institutions that have kind of given us these organizational strategies that are insipid and completely unworthy of us. One of the things I find is that, like, when I speak to my climate friends, I kind of like, one of the things that I find is, if, especially when we supposedly have this justice and virtue kind of obsession, one of the things that troubles me is the fact that one of the things in terms of ecological kind of circumstance is that one of in the history of circumstance of this sort, the Dutch and other places who had to deal with kind of like, kind of realities of kind of difficult circumstances, they engineered solutions.
Otherwise, the Netherlands would be underwater now. I
Yeah.
mean, it
So the thing
actually
is,
would.
one of the things that's true
They
is that
are a brilliant
we
group.
have
And
had decades now of research into the possibility and the potential of certain circumstances that we're going to encounter over time. And as more and more time goes on, I don't get any individual telling me there aren't engineered solutions for all of these issues.
yes, there are.
However, where's the incentive to the architect and the engineers from the politicians, from
No.
the activist groups? Where,
They
aside
actively
from
discourage them.
exactly. So
Actually.
the thing is, rather than go into a situation and say, hey, here's a tremendous opportunity for engineering and architecture to take on something that we know is something we have to deal with. Now, I don't see it in the architectural schools. I don't see it in the architectural students. I don't see it in the architectural thinking. I certainly don't see it in the architectural publications. But I do see it as, these are the opportunities. Now, entrepreneurs will basically take it upon themselves to employ engineers and architects
If
to
they
make
think
themselves
they can make money out of it.
exactly. And I mean, why shouldn't they? Because they take all the risk
Well, if
by
they can solve a
yeah,
problem,
exactly. So I look
sure.
at it this way:
Yeah,
if
they should profit.
if somebody needs the resources to kind of look at a problem and can solve that problem, all more power to them, because those are the people who basically kind of take the risk.
I'd like to quote the Ferengi.
Oh yes,
There's always time for a Star Trek quote.
absolutely.
In the Ferengi rules of acquisition, as the Ferengi say, war is good for profit, peace is good for profit.
Right.
And I think those are
And
actually,
you can go in any kind of situations, like famine is good for profit, kind of
well,
wealth
that
is
would
good.
be, associated with war or
No,
pestilence.
yeah, but I mean, like,
Right.
pestilence is good. No, but the whole idea is like, kind of chaos is good for
Well,
profit.
yeah, you can-
Order is good for profit.
Anyway, I want to
So yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay. Do you have more to say on that?
No, I'll
Okay.
go after.
I'd like to bring up something that most people don't think of when they think of, if they have, in fact, ever thought of quantitative imagination. We're hoping we spark your thoughts down new and glistening pathways. Chinese scholars' rocks. And I say that because they are a shining example of human imagination and ingenuity at work. Let me put it to you here. I would say, and my term for them is lithic psychology, as in rock, as in lithic. They are a hybridization of human intent an artist or sculptor's imagination upon organic forms and natural structures. Now, why quantitative? I'm going to answer that now. The Chinese scholars' rocks, and for those of you who are unfamiliar Look them up. You will find a new passion. You will be amazed. Is the accruement, I see them as the accruement of societal reflection. They are the organic mirrors of tumultuous times. The errors in which they were made, they started out in the Tang dynasty, not in their present form in any way, as huge rocks as ornaments in gardens. They were not at all what they came to be in the Sung. In the northern and the southern Sung, they became objects of study and contemplation and solitude on the scholar's desk. They became a desktop object that would fit on a scholar's desk. And what they are mostly made of Lingby limestone. That is the most popular rock. Yes, it has naturally incredibly fascinating forms, but they are chosen, they are shaped by humans. They are pulled out of the larger rocks, they are excavated, and there are many choices that go into it. And then a completely human carved wooden stand made of wood, which is always, which is always impervious to insect attack. I have never seen a wooden stand that has even a single insect borehole in it.
Mm-hmm.
You know how rare that is? And they are, and this is fascinating, not glued in,
Right.
not hammered in, not welded in, not they sit on their base, usually on a fine lithic point, as if they would tip, but they never do.
Mm.
So it's the perfect achievement of experiment, of balance, of sculpture, and only that rock is paired with its own base. No
Mm-hmm.
other rock fits the base, which undulates.
Mm. I think one of the
And
things
so,
that
what do you think of
no, I
that
think
as
it's
an
very true.
example?
One of the things I've always loved Scholars Rock. I mean, I'm not again. I feel as a child of Western civilization that I understand and appreciate the genius of Western art. However, that doesn't mean I don't admire other works. I very much admire Asian works, specifically the fact that in the Western tradition, we spoke about this earlier
Oh
in
yeah,
another
yeah.
thing,
We
but
had a
specific
previous
a
show
specific thing
on
here is
Eastern and
that
Western
you
art
know
traditions.
the study of a piece of Western art, especially in the times that we talk about in the kind of Western civilization, is to understand that which the individual artist is helping you to understand. So you get a sense of the character of an individual to give you an insight into human nature, or the objects to give you an insight into human nature. As Whitehead talked about, the descriptive artist, right, in terms of being able to kind of give insight into the circumstances of that which is the
Mm-hmm.
subject. On the other hand, the Eastern Scholars Rock is not about that. It's about being an object of meditation. It's actually in itself a generator. It in itself can give rise to imagination. In the case of interpreting Western art, the imagination is kind of somewhat slavishly dedicated to the work itself. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, in terms of the Scholar's Rock is not to be interpreted. It's to be seen as a generator of work itself, a generator of imagination. The meditation gives rise to in itself other objects, and not just another Scholar's
It's a
Rock,
very
but anything.
circular
It's
process,
exactly, it's a
actually.
process related object. And I don't see a parallel in Western art. I don't know if I need to see one, but I kind of see the value in the meditative object. I think meditation is an incredibly valuable thing. I think that Western architecture in itself is kind of a very uncontemplative thing, and it needs to be more contemplative. But at the same time, the Scholar's Rock, not as just meditation in order to kind of center yourself and a lot of these things, but it actually is a generator of imaginations. It basically, you see in the shapes, like you see almost it is a more rigorous nature of the shadow of the faces in the clouds. It kind of gives
Oh
rise
yeah,
to
much.
circumstances and formulations and kind of other kind of kind of processes. I think our natural impulse to see order and pattern is invigorated by scholars
Oh,
rocks.
I agree. That's really beautifully put. And I
I know.
would, yes, I would say it is a lithic psychological barometer.
Hmm.
And there were very tumultuous times, as I've been in every country, but these were particularly tumultuous times in China. There were political upheavals, there were invasions, there were societal upheavals. And in fact, when I look at the scholars' rocks that were crafted in these specific times in the dynasties, in certain portions of the dynasties, there are forms in the rocks that, in my mind, conjure a more peaceful environment. They become a still life of solitude. They have a sanctuary heart. And in the more tumultuous times, in the warring times, of which there were many, 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 and the executions, and there were times of huge political upheaval, which actually spawned tons and tons of wall scrolls of the solitudinous scholar who literally fled the cities to
Mm.
live alone in the mountains
Hmm. Hmm.
in a hovel, just to
Mm.
get away from the stress and the
Yeah.
tumultuous nature of the
Right,
politics.
which I think is
So
another kind of,
yeah,
and that's another kind of thing about the homogenization, or the kind of, I wouldn't even say homogenization, because that's actually a productive thing. I'd say the kind of like uh, the simplistification of the institutions in terms of their models and their organizational
mm,
strategies, is the fact that they've become incredibly oversimplified because it's an incredibly conservative environment.
yeah,
So I think in that case, what we do is we see the fact that we need to kind of understand that we have to put the onus back on the artists. And one of the things I think that happens is by this type of situation is that we stop being so congregational. I think that one of the things that happens is that there's the isolation is incredibly important, and I think it's become we've become too communal in terms of the way in which we kind of have homogenized, or now again, like we've kind of taken the imagination out of our place, because we've demonized the individual who goes off on his own. We've put ourselves in a position where we kind of feel ourselves as like some kind of like artistic collective, rather than the places of kind of unbridled
I've
genius.
never ever thought of myself as part of any
No, I know. Well, I
collective
mean, no, we talked about
ever.
that, and
Yeah,
the fact that, like, for a long time, Cooper was the last bastion of that
true
mentality, of the fact that, like,
individuality.
that you really wanted to nurture the individual genius rather than kind of create someone who just had the kind of like certain kind of
The
appearance. Yeah,
cachet.
exactly. In
Cooper was
fact, I
never
remember
concerned with
somebody said to
cachet.
me recently, I don't know if I said this, is that someone
Mm.
said to me, it's like, you have the appearance of someone who appears to be an artist. And that was different, they explained to me, than basically someone who looks like a lot of other people who look like artists. That there's a difference between giving an aura of a creative individual and basically looking like other people who want to give the appearance
Right,
of being a
wearing the
creative individual.
costume of
Right,
what they
exactly.
think is an
So the thing
artist.
is, like,
It's
having
not.
the appearance of an individual with a certain character, as opposed to just simply wearing the costume. Yeah.
If
So
oh yeah,
in
yeah.
let's say,
Sorry.
as we get to
Yeah.
wrap up, so any last thoughts?
Well, yes, I will add this, and people are unfamiliar because they don't look back to understand their present and future. Look at photographs of Paul Klee, of Max Ernst, of Picasso, of Kandinsky, or Miro, not Salvador Dali in his later days when he kind of, had the bizarre persona, but he was an artist of incredible skill and talent. So I would never say anything to malign that. He did have a flair for the dramatic, but none of these people in their day wore the costume that someone might associate with an artist. They wore just very comfortable, very plain, very utilitarian clothes that served their needs for working in the studio,
Mm-hmm.
finding their
Mm-hmm.
specimens.
Mm-hmm.
They were not pretending to be artists or wanting to
Mm-hmm.
look like artists. They were
Mm-hmm.
artists,
Yeah.
real artists,
Yeah.
genuine. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So next week, we're
Yes.
going to go back to a topic that we've talked about specifically as we head towards that idea of the beauty of original ideas, which is going to be on the 11th of January. So the topic is the personality of the draftsman as opposed to the copyist. And then after that, we're going to talk about the loss of the
Nice.
poster in the public square, Maeterlinck's organic engineering, drawing as a generator. And I guess what I'll also do is kind of talk about, I should probably have one about the model as generator or the drawing model kind of symbiosis as a generator, which is probably more correct. And then we'll basically be moving that direction. So anyway,
Yes.
that's where we're headed next week. So it'll hopefully give us more insight into moving that direction, because I think it's important to understand the personality types and the consequence of the realities in which these personality types exist. So next week, we'll see you next week. This was our first anniversary, so it's been fun. The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to keep it that way. Thank you.
Thank you.